Hey, you guys, welcome to History of Thought 2. And today we are going to talk about existentialism, a teeny bit about Camus, but more on him next time, and pretty much focus mostly on Sartre. But first, before you watch this video lecture, I would highly recommend that you watch the two other required short videos. The one is the crash course philosophy video on existentialism, which is about 8 minutes, and then the School of Life philosophy video on Sartre, which is about 6.5 minutes. So go watch those and then come back to this one. So existentialism is one of the major philosophical movements of the 20th century that seeks to address questions of existence, human nature, and the meaning of life. Now, the historical context is we're kind of to the mid 20th century, the years around World War II and following the war. So there are many changes, obviously, that have taken place in the world, and the mass death of World War II and the Holocaust, as well as rising secularism in the West. This is all sort of within the context of existentialist thinking. In other words, how do we find meaning in what is often seen as a meaningless world? That's really sort of the central question of existentialism. So, a little bit of a review of some of the things we've covered so far. I mean, certainly these questions about what is the essence of human beings, how do humans find meaning in their lives and in the world in modern times, and we've been looking at the past 200 years, and obviously these are classic philosophical questions that all human beings have been asking for thousands of years. But in the context of this class, and primarily in the West in the past couple hundred years, we've already seen quite a few answers. We've seen Enlightenment answers, especially with Kant, that there is universal human rationality, well, in theory, right, implied unequally. And we've read people who want it to be implied more equally. But, this idea that we're all capable of achieving reason and rationality, but it's really hard to do because we're lazy, because we're cowardly, because we're sheeple. But, Kant and the Enlightenment is sort of encouraging us to sapere ode, have courage to use your own reason. We also looked at Marx and Marxist perspectives and ideas of species being, that creating and putting our labor into something to make something beyond ourselves is really kind of the essence of humans, and that, capitalism sort of makes us not be able to achieve that from their perspective. But also from a Marxist perspective, most of whom we think we are is a result of how the economic and social system has constructed us. This is kind of false consciousness. And we also looked at sort of later Marxists and how the culture industry really makes sort of alienation seem kind of bearable, and that was Adorno. We've also looked at Nietzsche and the idea that there really is no such thing as a human essence from his perspective. No soul, no God, not even universal human rationality. So he's breaking with the Enlightenment that way. No ultimate meaning to life. But ultimately, you have to, from Nietzsche's perspective, strive to be your best possible you. Strive to be sort of the Übermensch, even though no one's probably really going to be able to. Create your own values. Be the best authentic you, although most of you are sheeple and you won't. And then from Freud, we get the idea that all humans have certain basic desires and drives. And this has shaped ourselves and our civilizations, our cultures, in productive and unproductive ways. And many of these basic desires or drives or urges must be pushed down or redirected in order for humans to live together collectively, to various levels of success, of course. Sometimes this just makes us miserable. So another perspective of these big questions that all of these philosophers have been looking at is existentialism. So the central idea of existentialism is existence precedes essence. So what does this actually mean, especially according to Sartre, who's the one who investigates it most fully? What does this actually mean for human freedom, according to Sartre? So existence precedes essence. It means that there is no such thing as a human essence since we are born with. There is nothing essential about what it means to be human. Humans first exist, and then they spend their lifetime creating and changing who they are. So what is our purpose as humans without an essence? How do we construct meaning in our lives? This is really kind of connected to Nietzsche's parable of the madman. God is dead and we have killed him. And if you remember, what did Nietzsche mean? That with sort of increasing secularism in the West and with sort of declining religiosity and especially sort of declining versions of religion that sort of unquestionably adhere to what religious authorities tell us. So it's both sort of secularism, but it's also sort of a more liberal view of religion, even for those who continue to be religious. What's Nietzsche afraid of? God is dead and we have killed him. That he's really worried about the problem of nihilism in the West. Like, Nietzsche's no fan of religion, but he's also worried about what happens when we don't have anything to base our moral systems on, or that we think that we don't. And so he, if you remember, he predicts the West will sort of fall into sort of this nihilism of there's no meaning to anything for a while. And this is even more of an apparent question culturally in the West after World War II, and the most deadly conflict in human history by far, and of course the horrors of the Holocaust and everything that comes after that. But is sort of this nihilism the only reaction? Can we find meaning in a world without the absolute authority of religion to provide a moral and ethical system? And this isn't just a question for atheists and agnostics, although, that's what a lot of these philosophers, the perspective they're coming from, but there are sort of Christian existentialists as well, and Jewish existentialists as well. That even the way many people are religious and spiritual in the modern world is very different than how medieval Christianity operated in the West. The many varieties of Christianity and Judaism and other religions ask us to question, to not blindly follow authority, and to find our own personal spiritual truths. And a lot of people do this on their own. But regardless if one is sort of approaching these questions from a spiritual or a secular perspective, many of us often feel ethically lost, unmoored, uncertain in modern times. But what can working through this actually lead to beyond Nietzsche's feared nihilism? Does it just mean that we're all going to say, there's no meaning to anything at all, right? This is when we talk next time about Camus, this is sort of when he says the central problem of philosophy is, why shouldn't I kill myself? I mean, that's a little rough way of putting it, but it's like, how do we find meaning? And the existentialists are giving us sort of a way forward, I think, beyond Nietzsche. So what is this condition of human existence that Sartre describes as nausea? And, what is this feeling of nausea primarily a result of? Now, Sartre's 1938 novel, one of his early works, is called Nausea, and it's about a historian, a writer, and his existential crisis. But nausea is this feeling we get in those moments when we are struck with the absolute strangeness, weirdness, and ultimately meaninglessness of life. We feel unmoored, unattached, disassociated, off balance, unhinged. We are really faced with our absolute freedom as humans. So how do we go about creating meaning in a meaningless world? And this is really, as I said, the central preoccupation with existentialism, with both Sartre and Camus. And then later we'll be talking about, next week, Simone de Beauvoir, sort of feminist existentialism, and Frantz Fanon, sort of Black existentialism. So one way which we're going to talk about next time a lot more, but I'll just mention a little bit, is Camus, another existential philosopher besides Sartre, and his idea of the absurd. And, this is really about the conflict between the human tendency to seek inherent value and meaning in life and the human inability to find any due to the lack of any actual meaning or value. So we exist simultaneously both with this innate, deep desire to have some kind of value or meaning or purpose in our life, and at the same time recognizing that there can never be in an absolute sense. So we exist simultaneously with both of these. We constantly ask for answers, even though we know we'll never really get any. And Camus says, this is again sort of the central question of philosophy: is why not just commit suicide? And why don't we? I mean, I know that's kind of a difficult question to grapple with, but I think what he's really looking for is some kind of way to construct meaning and hope. in a world that often sometimes seems like it doesn't have any. But the existentialists are giving us this very, I think, positive path forward. And one thing we'll talk about a lot when we talk about Camus next time is the myth of Sisyphus. So Sisyphus is this is a Greek myth, and Sisyphus is a human who is condemned by the gods to keep pushing a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll down again. And once it rolls all the way down, he has to start all over. In other words, he keeps doing this over and over and over and over again. That's his punishment, right? That's sort of his personal hell. But, Camus will say that we have to imagine Sisyphus happy at doing this, and he imagines himself as happy, that Sisyphus and ourselves have to keep at it. We have to keep sort of pushing that boulder up the hill, even though that we know it's going to roll back down over and over again. Why? And that's something we'll talk about with Camus. What is Camus saying about creating meaning in our lives? What is our purpose in life? So, yeah, as I said, we'll be talking about the myth of Sisyphus a little bit more, Camus' writings on it, as well as a little bit about the plague. Camus' novel, which is really using plague and pestilence, a pandemic, as a metaphor for something else. And you'll watch not a selection from the reading, you'll actually watch a video about the plague that also has some biographical details about Camus. So we'll come back to these but next time. So again, what Sartre, what Camus, what all of these existentialists are really pushing us towards is that we can create meaning in a meaningless world. And there's some specific concepts that they're going to give us to point the way. So one of Sartre's most famous phrases is that humans are condemned to be free. So what does he actually mean by this? I mean, for existentialists, humans are free. But we are so radically free. In fact, it's hard to deal with when we realize this absolute freedom. In other words, for existentialists, I mean, certainly there are sort of practical limitations on what we can or can't do, given our position in society and, structural inequalities and all that. But, really at the end of the day, there's nothing from stopping us. There's not a lot stopping us for kind of trying to do whatever we want. For existentialists, there's not... okay, sorry about the interruption. For existentialists, right, there's not really any kind of moral or ethical restrictions on human behavior that come from above. And for a lot of people, they'll say that this realization of how radically free we are, that do we really have to abide by social conventions? Do we really have to abide by what all the people around us tell us to do? Do we really have to abide by the rules of society? Do we really have to do what the priest tells us and what the politician tells us and what our parents tell us? I mean, really, do we really? I mean, what is actually making us do that? Human convention and human rules. But for a lot of people, this absolute freedom, this realization can be jolting, disorienting, and even scary at first. That's nausea, these moments when we just sort of realize, oh my God. But it can also be completely liberating and joyful. So this isn't nihilism, right? This isn't, oh, well, there's no meaning to anything. But it's this kind of elation in realizing that we're not constrained and we can construct our own selves and our own lives. I mean, it may be hard, it may not be easy, but there's nothing sort of holding us back in terms of what we have to do. I mean, again, there may be structural sort of inequalities, but, those are not sort of rules that have come down from above that we are forced to live by. And de Beauvoir will talk kind of more about this from a feminist perspective. Sartre often talks about the anguish of existence, these moments of realizing our true freedom, when we realize we're really just kind of making all this crap up as a society as we go along. Cultural norms, social rules, political systems, economic structures, even religious practices. I mean, one interesting way, and this is a little stranger doing this on a video lecture, but think about all the rules and norms that structure our existence in this classroom. I mean, in a typical classroom, students come in, they sit down, they may talk a little bit before class starts, but the teacher comes in, sets up. Once the teacher starts talking, everybody's quiet. When you want to ask a question, you raise your hand. There's sort of conventions of when the teacher's lecturing, you don't interrupt. You don't start, doing something else like watching a movie loudly on your phone. You don't start talking loudly to the person next to you. If there's a conversation, you abide, in a discussion, you abide by sort of the conventions of that. I mean, but why? Why do you do all of that? You don't have to, right? I mean, I guess Freud would have some answers, right? You don't want to be socially shamed, but none of it has to be that way. I mean, there is no sort of God of classroom etiquette who dictates to all of us that this is the way it has to be. And if any of us violate that law, we are immediately, smited down and burned to cinder, right? You could not show up if you didn't want to. You could talk loudly the whole time. I could just stand there and say nothing and wait for you guys to say some stuff, right? If somebody else is talking, you could interrupt them. I mean, we all follow these conventions for a number of reasons, right? But really, you don't have to. Think of all of the things that you do in your life that's sort of following these norms and these rules and these expectations. And you don't have to. You don't have to do any of it. I mean, there could be consequences to it, right? You don't have to go to work, but then you might not be able to afford your rent or food, but you still don't have to go to work. I mean, you have to face the consequences. But, this is, how does this make you feel? Anguish, joy, fear, wonder, liberated, all of it? So, given all of that, how do we find meaning in a meaningless world? Or one that is sort of purported to be meaningless by the existentialists. How do we create ourselves when there is no essence to human beings? So existentialists would say we are each responsible to give our own lives meaning and to construct who we are and to create our own meaning to our lives. I mean, this is kind of in line with Nietzsche, but they're going to be a lot more positive and optimistic about most people's ability to do it. But, this is really hard to do. This is a huge responsibility. I mean, this goes back to Kant, right? That it's easy to be lazy. It's easy to be sheeple. It's easy to just sort of follow the crowd. This is why Sartre says we are condemned to be free. We must all accept the full weight of our freedom, our need to create meaning, but also sort of the ultimate meaninglessness of all of it. This is the absurd. So what is Sartre's idea of bad faith? How does, and there's a particular story that's told in the video that I'll kind of recount, but, how is it that we can sort of go wrong in this process? And bad faith is when we continue to believe that there's some kind of essence that we're born with and that there are pre-existing givens in a human life. So when we stick to the routines and habits of our lives, because we buy into the fact that it must be that way or how it's supposed to be. For example, the authority of certain individuals and institutions to tell us what to do. And there's the story of, the Sartre's pupil in the video who during the war sort of had two options, could go and fight for the war and make, a very small difference in a very large cause, or stay home and take care of his ailing mother, which would make, a very large difference, but in just one person's life. And this is a moral dilemma, and the student is sort of seeking advice. Sartre, what should I do? And Sartre's answer, by even asking me to answer this for you, you're acting in bad faith. You need to make this decision for yourself and based on sort of your own authentic self, right? So Kant and Nietzsche, will tell us humans often take the easy route and follow what others tell them, right? You can follow norms because it's convenient or because it's easy. But while recognizing their artificiality and your freedom to do it differently, right? So they're not saying like break all the rules and don't follow any norms, but just be aware, why you're doing it. You know, if you're going to sort of follow a particular social convention, don't do it because, well, that's what everyone does. Do it because you've thought about it and, you recognize its artificiality, but, there's a reason you're going to do it anyway. Like, I don't know, go to your job so you can eat, right? So what does this mean for freedom in practice? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more with de Beauvoir. But existentialists place a lot of importance on free will, on choice, and responsibility. It's up to each individual, not others or society, to give meaning to their lives and living it sincerely and authentically. And we've talked about this many times. What would you do if you didn't have to worry about money? How would you live your life? And the question is, why aren't you doing it now? If it's structural factors, right? I mean, there's lots of factors that affect the ability of individuals to do so beyond their control. All individuals don't have the same ability to live their lives the way they want, right? Class, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, gender identity, ability, age, all of these kinds of things affect our ability to sort of realize our freedom. So how do the existentialists consider this point? Ultimately, this is why Sartre is so critical of capitalism, because he sees it as limiting human freedom. And feminist existentialist Simone de Beauvoir looks specifically at the oppression of women from an existentialist perspective in her work, The Second Sex, which we'll read in a couple class periods. And de Beauvoir explicitly recognized that members of oppressed groups have even more difficult time of achieving freedom, that their oppression limits their ability to act, projects are circumscribed by society, choices are limited, expectations are constraining. So their destinies may be even more shaped by the appearance that oppression is somehow natural. So part of the work of existentialism is sort of deconstructing the notion of essence that a lot of oppression is based on. Existentialists recognize the material and social constraints of our freedom that we have no control over. But even given all of those, we still must embrace our freedom and construct our own meanings within these limitations. Don't use them as an excuse to live in bad faith. And that's what the existentialists would say. So we'll be talking about existentialism and Sartre in class. And then the other section that you'll be working on is also Camus and the myth of Sisyphus, and a little bit about the plague and his notion of the absurd. And then next week, we'll continue existentialism when we talk about feminist existentialism with Simone de Beauvoir, as well as a little bit about existentialist ethics and her sort of feminist perspective on existentialist ethics. And then we'll be rounding out existentialism with Black existentialism and Black existentialist thinker Frantz Fanon. Okay. See you guys in class to discuss existentialism.